In this walkthrough, we're going through the managing files area of this course. We're going to skip all of this content to kind of prerequisites to understanding what a Git repository is and how it works and pulling code and things like that. And we'll get right to setting up a repository. So what we're going to do is sign in to github.com. And once you sign in, you may or may not see some activity as part of this course. So your screenshots may be different than mine. We're going to hit this add up in the top right and hit new repository. From here, we'll get all the information that we need to create a new repository. We can, by default, it'll be ourselves as the owner of this repository, or you can choose this course/organization. It depends on who you want to be the owner of each repository based on the project itself. So we're going to create a repository called get example. These repository names per organization or per your account need to be unique, so that's why it's checking to make sure it's unique. And we'll put a description, example get repository inside of here. And we can choose if this repository should be public or private. Depending on the project, you can make this determination. If you have something that you don't want to be out there publicly from now until forever, totally make it private. You can always reverse that decision at any time to make it public and allow others to see it after you have it to your project to a specific state. And we are going to initialize the repository with a README file. This is a standard file that we'll talk about in a minute that mostly is included in most all Git repositories. So we'll click create this repository. It should take only a second. We'll go through this interface a little bit later in a different video, but for now all that we need to know is that on GitHub there is a repository inside of this organization. It does have our description here. It does have one file, our README file, and there's a preview of that README file itself. So let's say we want to make some changes to this code base. What we're going to do is clone this down to our local computer. We're going to open in desktop. This is the GitHub desktop application that you should have set up through that setup process on this course. We will open in GitHub desktop. It will give us a indicator that we want to clone a repository. Oh, and you know what? I did have to record this more than once, so let me remove this here, and then let me bring this back here. Let me cancel this, let me close this, let's do this again. So let's go back here, and then let's hit open in desktop. So this will be more in line with what you're seeing on your computer. It will ask us, we're going to clone a repository from a URL. It will put in automatically the URL with a .get extension. That's actually where the files live. And then it'll ask us for a local path. My recommendation for this course, and really moving forward with any Git repositories, is that inside of your user directory, make a folder called sites and name folders within there the context at which those repositories exist. So this Git example is going to exist within the INFX 512 folder itself, so that way you can keep all of your repositories related to this course in the same spot. Same thing with if you're working on your personal projects, make a folder called personal. If you're working at a company and you have Git repositories, put them in a company folder. So we will clone this. What this is doing behind the scenes, although it went really fast, is getting a copy of not only the recent files in this project, but all the historical versions of those files. We'll go through that in a minute, but I want to show you that inside of this current repository, if you click down here, you'll see any other repositories that you have set up within GitHub Desktop. That's how you can switch between them. You'll see that I have a few set up mainly for this course, a lot for screenshots for the tutorials within this course. But within our Get example here, we'll see that right now we have 0 changes that we've made so far. We'll get to that in a second. We can click on our history and see what actually has happened with this repository. We have an initial commit that we did 3 minutes ago. Actually, GitHub did this on our behalf when we told it to create a README file with the actual contents of that file. We'll see a little bit more about this interface and why this kind of looks a little funky right now, but it'll make sense once we start changing some files. And then we'll also have a different tutorial to talk about branches, and we'll get to fetching and pushing at the end of this example here. So now that we have this content locally on our computer, what we will do is open up Visual Studio Code, and we will file open, and we will find our folder for INFX 512. We will open up our get example, and we will hit open. What that will do is it'll refresh this a little bit, and your editor may look a little bit different than mine. I included a bunch of extensions that are available inside of this sidebar here that I would recommend using. Maybe I'll do a specific tutorial on this editor if I didn't already, to get it to a point where it's really easy to edit HTML and markdown files and other things. But for our use case right now, all we care about is that we have the file, the only file in our project, inside of this Explorer down here. When we click on it, we can click and see the contents of that file. So in any Git repository, there are special files. There's actually a special folder which doesn't show up here. It's a .get folder, which we won't get into now, but it contains all the information about the history of every file and every change made to any of these files within the repository itself. It won't show up here, but we're going to make a new file, another special file called a get ignore file. And what this does, doesn't have any real use in your project other than when you have either private information, either passwords, keys for services, information that you don't, that are other people's code that you don't want added to your repository, or things that are kind of compiled code, which we will get to later down in this course. These are things that you don't want published into your repository all the time. This get ignore file allows you to, on each line, put a file name or a folder name, and it will completely ignore that file or folder when you go to commit it to the repository. So, for example, macOS has a specific file called dsstore that it puts into folders whenever you start opening a folder in Finder, move things around, any information about the visual presence of the folder itself, it will store inside this file. That's something that has no use to your code, and so what we're going to do is tell Get to just completely ignore that file, no matter where it exists inside of the structure within a project. And then another example, which we'll get to further in this course, is there is node modules, is a folder that gets created whenever you start pulling in other code into your project through npm. And that folder has compiled code that isn't yours and really should be pulled down every time you start the project itself. So there shouldn't be a copy or a snapshot of those files when you commit your code to your own repository. So you'll often see that inside of the get ignore file. So inside of Visual Studio Code, you'll notice that it does have some interface things to work with source control and Git repositories. We're not going to use this as part of our course. You can if you want. Just for a consistency standpoint, we're going to use the GitHub desktop application. Oops, let me go back to Visual Studio Code here. And what we'll do is I'm going to move this over and I'm going to move this over, just so that way I can get in between things without it having to go back and forth. So now what we're going to do is add some lines to our readme.md file. This is a Markdown document. I included some links to Markdown as a file format and what it means to format things specifically in text, which at the end of the day gets rendered to HTML. But we'll see here, let's add a header. So headers are denoted by 2. So a header level 2 is denoted by 2 hash symbols here. And header level 1, our top level heading, similar to if you're not used to yet HTML or Microsoft Word is probably the next example where you have the largest heading, level 1, second level 2, 3, and 4, etc. The goal is that heading level 2s describe a little bit more about their their heading level 1 that they're contained within. So this example get repository, we're going to add a header for our name. So, or let's put author. And inside of that, we're going to add a paragraph for myself, Nick Denardis. And we will put in an email address. Actually, let's do this. Do instructor, and then we will also put Washington. Actually, you know what? Let's not even bother with that. Let's just put the author information here. And let's save this. So now, inside of our README, we made some changes to our file. You'll notice that those changes are kind of highlighted here within the editor itself, so we know which lines have been added. If we were to remove a line, if say we got rid of this and put that up there, you'll see that there's another color, and your interface may be a little bit different just depending on how you set it up, but there'll be another indicator that these two other lines have changed. So we'll put that back, put this in here, we have our get_ignore file, and let's say, all right, we're ready to commit this code. So let's go back to our GitHub desktop application. It'll show us that we have two changed files. We have a get_ignore file, which has been added, so completely added, and then we have a README markdown file that has some sort of change inside of it. That change will show us what was there, and then anything with a plus and green will be anything that was added. Let's remove this again and save that, and we'll see anything that's in red with a minus will give us the lines that were removed. That way we can keep track of every specific change that was added to each file and repository every time we commit this code. So our get_ignore, it's all going to be additions because it's a brand new file. So we're going to select both of these changes, and we are going to write a summary about what this change is. So inside of the tutorial itself, there is a nice line here. It's something to always remember when you are committing code. Let's get down here. All right, so when writing your summary, it should be a short couple of words or sentence, and then the description can be longer. But if you only write a summary, the goal is to explain to yourself, your future self, and or other developers, if applied, this commit will, and then complete that sentence. So add instructions to the README. So as an example, what we did here is we add, if applied, this commit will add author information to README and add a get_ignore. Oops, get_ignore file. So this might be a little long. The goal is to have this under 72 or so characters, but for our case here, this is descriptive enough for what we did. You don't have to outline everything inside of this title. That's primarily where this description area is for longer form information if you make a lot of changes. So what we'll do is we will commit this to master, and if for whatever reason you need to undo real fast, there is an undo button right here which undoes the whole thing. And say you wanted to edit something, that sometimes will happen. Actually, it'll happen probably more often than you think. So let's go back and commit it to master again, just so that way it is committed. We can go to our history tab here. We'll see that this is now part of the history of this repository. So we have our initial commit, which gives us the state of our project as it existed initially. We have our adding author information, and this gives us now the new state of the project. So as we don't have any more changes beyond that, what we're going to do, say we want to share this now with the world and or other developers on the team, this push origin up here will show us that we have this number 1 here with the up arrow means that we have one commit that we only have on our local computer, and it's time to, or we need to, push it up to origin. Origin, in our case, is this GitHub repository here. So if we refresh this, since we haven't pushed this, it hasn't made it yet to GitHub. I have all of a different tutorial to go through this interface, but here is the same history we can see within this commits area here. So it does not have this add author information to README. What we're going to do is we're going to push this up. It takes a second. It might take multiple seconds depending on your internet connection and how many files you've added to the repository. But once we go back to GitHub, we're going to refresh this and we'll see that our commit is now here. Every commit has a specific ID associated with it. That ID is unique to this individual commit overall, so that way everyone is identified. When we go back to the home page, or let's click on code here, it now shows us the current state of our repository where we have 2 files and it has author information here, it has our get example information here. The last thing that I'll show here is notice how inside of the README Markdown on here, it did have this as a new line compared to this line. Play a little bit with Markdown. Go through a little the overall exercise to read through each of the formatting details. But when you're editing inside of here, it's always good to use Visual Studio Code has this preview mode for Markdown off to the side here. If you click on that, this little button, it will give you a preview of what that file will look like when it is actually published. And you'll see that I didn't expect this to be on a new line, but when it actually gets rendered, it is on a new line. So the way to put in a line break in Markdown is to add 2 spaces after the end of any one line. It will make a new line to that next line itself. So actually, you know what? I have a setting set on my editor that will strip out new lines by default, or 2 spaces, or like any spaces at the end of the line by default. There is a way to ignore that. I will show you that in a separate example, but in your editor without that extension turned on, it should save without a problem. Like I mentioned, there's a few things that I have added to mine that you may not already have added to yours, but we'll be doing that in a future video. But that is the walkthrough of how to create, clone a repository, edit some information inside of that repository, make the change, commit it to the repository itself, push it up to the origin so others can see it. When they clone it now, they'll have this newest version, and how to preview Markdown files within VS Code.